It's time to pick a Popcak here on Morning Offering. And our Popcak for this morning, Mr. Finn,
is
Jacob. Jacob Popcak for this morning. Good morning, Jacob. How are you?
Are we going to talk about Lent, maybe?
Yeah. No, I'm doing very well. I mean, it's a little early to be eating the tartar sauce quite yet.
Yeah, we're not getting started yet.
Not just for lunch anymore.
That's right.
But we want to talk about focusing on Lent as a time of listening and relationship instead of a time for isolation or withdrawing for withdrawing's sake.
Yeah. I think, so often, especially, right now in the age of the internet, we can really treat Lent the way we would, a challenge, like an internet challenge, right? I've heard people refer to Lent even as, a prayer challenge or, different things like this, being about self-improvement, right? And then, of course, there's the other way to sort of treat Lent, which is this very sort of dour, let me suffer for suffering's sake because suffering is great, and let me be miserable and let me fast just to show myself how hard I can go and how much I can push myself, as though it's some kind of endurance contest, right? And that's really, as much as our hearts are in the right place, I have to caution listeners that that's really not the right way to be approaching this season. The Bible is very clear. I was reading the scriptures for today, and the people in our reading from Isaiah, our first reading from Isaiah, are wondering why they're working so hard, they're fasting so hard, they're struggling so much, and yet they don't seem to be being noticed by God, right? They don't really understand, why He doesn't seem to be responding to them. And God replies, He says, lo, on your fast day, you carry out your own pursuits. You drive all of your laborers, and your fast ends in quarreling and fighting, right? So He's saying, look, you might be fasting, but you're still treating the people who work for you poorly. You're still being mean to, the people who work for you. You're not being generous with them. And you're still fighting with your neighbors. You're fighting with your families. You're being unkind. Right? And I think that really puts us right to the heart of what Lent really should be for, which is not just removing things like, oh, I'm going to fast from chocolate, or, oh, I'm going to fast for social media, just because, I want to just, suffer or not have access to those things. It's about making space, removing those things to make space that we can then fill with greater virtuous treatment of others. Because I've given up my phone, for instance, for Lent, because I've given up social media for Lent, I might now be more responsive to my child, right? I'm making room to be more attentive to my spouse, right? Because I've given up, that food, for instance, that candy, for instance, it can awaken me to the fact that normally I'd use that to cope. And now instead of coping by, stuffing my face with dessert afterwards, I have to, make room for new ways of coping by, for instance, taking time to really listen to God and connect with Him, or taking time to talk to my friend about what I'm going through, or to, again, talk to my spouse about what I'm going through, those sorts of things. It's about creating space to fill it with something better, not just creating space for space's sake. And I think Pope Leo himself really drives this even further forward this week, because he kind of presented his own invitation to all of us this Lent. He said, let's make this Lent about listening. This year, he says, I would like to first consider the importance of making room for the world through listening. And then he goes on to say, God Himself teaches us that listening is one of His defining characteristics. He hears the cry of the oppressed, right? He hears, how we're suffering and what our needs are, and He shares His heart with us, right? And so Pope Leo is encouraging us to actually intentionally make this Lent explicitly the point to be, I want to be someone who's an expert at listening by the end. I want to be someone who can really sit with my spouse and really listen to them and not rush ahead to fix what they're talking about. I want to be someone who really listens to my child, getting on eye contact with them and really talking to them on their level and hearing them out, not just rushing to give them some moral lesson or some answer. Right? I want to be someone who's an expert at listening to my neighbor and those suffering in my community, even if that challenges my own viewpoints or perspectives, right? To be there for those suffering, or as Pope Leo references in Scripture, those people who are in anguish. I want to be better at listening to myself, right? I want to be better at listening to my own inner needs and my own feelings that we're so often really, really good at ignoring because we don't like to think about what's going on inside. We want to be kind of numb to that stuff. And normally we use a lot of those things that we are now giving up, like dessert or, social media, doom scrolling or those kinds of things. Normally we use that stuff to ignore what's going on in the innermost part of ourselves. But again, what if we took this Lent to remove those things so that we can listen more to that innermost part of ourselves and figure out what our needs are? And then, of course, all of that, the listening to my spouse, my kids, my friends, the people suffering in my community, all of that then leads back to the ultimate point, which is learning to kind of go into that analogous desert like Christ so that we can really listen to the heart of God, right? I think that if we can approach with that listening spirit, it's going to really shift how we encounter all of this.
And I think, don't you think, Jacob, a big part of this is so often we just look at the external act, prayer, fasting, almsgiving, and we don't do what Christ calls us to do, that this is very much attached to our interiority, the why we're doing it. And so if we don't, you call it kind of making room, but it is this sense, right, that I have to know why I'm doing these things and not just do them blindly because this is what the church asks. And that intentionality then gives meaning to those external acts and also then keeps us converting our hearts, right? Rend your hearts, not your garments, right? So it keeps us in this conversion process through that whole time.
100%. I think you're spot on, and I'm so glad you make that point. Yeah, as we're still in the early days, and I think many people are still working out exactly what they're going to do for Lent. And I know many of my clients are saying, "Well, I got these 50 different books that I'm going to read, for my church library, and I'm going to give up all these desserts." And here's the thing, guys. If you can't draw a one-to-one connection line between how this is going to make you a better, more loving listener to the people around you, maybe try something else that you can draw that one-to-one line with. Because suffering just for suffering's sake is not mysticism. It's just masochism, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Nicely done, Jacob. Glad that you were the Popcak we picked for today. God bless you, brother.
Thanks,
Have
Jacob.
a great day.